What makes some towns successful, growing, and thriving? Why do others seem to just stay stuck in an approach and routine that may have served well enough in the past, but isn't meshing well with the current realities and future aspirations? Over the next few months, the News Project hopes to explore these whys and wherefores with several community leaders from towns around Vermont. We're starting with a conversation we had earlier this summer with Daniel Herriges, a senior editor and content manager for Strong Towns, a nonprofit media advocacy organization which produces articles, podcasts, and other content that analyzes the failures of post-war North American development patterns while hopefully giving citizens the knowledge and tools to start making their towns better than they may be at present. We met Daniel at the Southern Vermont Economic Development Summit held earlier this year at Mount Snow, where he gave one of the presentations, and were impressed and intrigued by the discussion he led, so we followed that up with a Zoom call. As you've gone through and looked at communities, and are there certain elements that stand out as to what makes for a strong town or community resilience? Are there certain common elements you're seeing repeated over and over between communities that sort of are surviving and those that are thriving?
Yeah, there are. We like to say that being a strong town is a process. It's not a destination. You know, we're asked often, like, point me to an example of a place in the U.S. that's doing everything right. And the reality is that the pattern of development that is a problem in our cities and towns is one that we adopted nationally and in a lot of cases through top-down federal policy. And there's a whole economic environment supporting it. So places are kind of being buffeted by these forces, a lot of which are outside of local control. But what we see is that there are places that are doing a really good job of working to counter those forces and working to make themselves resilient at a local level. And so the commonalities in approach are essentially the things that we've identified as the strong towns approach that we see cities doing. And those are to relentlessly do the math in terms of the long-term obligations that you're taking on when you either make public investments or when you pursue private development. What infrastructure are you committing yourself as a city to maintain generation after generation? What services are you committing to provide? What are the long-term obligations that you are assuming when you grow, when you develop? And how do those square up against the revenue sources that you are going to have access to? So we urge every community to really rigorously do that math. I think another thing is we find if you do the math and if you look at where are the places within our cities that are paying for themselves and then some, where are the places where the revenue coming in, the private wealth being generated easily covers the cost of providing infrastructure and providing services and maintaining those things in perpetuity. What we see is a very, very consistent pattern. The places that are doing this, the places that are financially strong and financially solvent are the places built according to the traditional development pattern that essentially precedes post-war suburbia. And so what that development pattern looks like is it is compact. It is designed around people who are going to walk for a lot of their needs, or they're at least going to be able to walk around the community and get to stuff they value. So things are close together. You have mixed uses. So you have residences and businesses and offices interspersed. And you have a tight, compact development pattern, and you have relatively modest public infrastructure. You tend to have narrow streets. You don't have huge amounts of land devoted to parking or landscaping or things that aren't directly generating value. And fundamentally, those are the characteristics of the pre-automobile, the kind of pre-suburban traditional development pattern. Compact places built to be walkable. And what we see over and over and over is that within any given city, within any given town, the place where you find that development pattern is punching way, way, way above its weight in terms of subsidizing the rest of the city, essentially. In terms of what we find is that the places that have that compact, walkable development pattern are punching way, way above their weight in terms of generating the private wealth needed to sustain public investments. And so there are places that are kind of blessed with, that sort of legacy infrastructure and that legacy development pattern because they were built in a time before everyone drove everywhere and before our cities were designed around driving. But there are also places that are making really smart decisions to develop today around walkability and around having vibrant streets that are destinations rather than just thoroughfares. And that's where we see cities making really smart, financially sound decisions.
So then I guess what went wrong with the post-World War II pattern of suburban development was the automobile then. The fact that that became the transportation mode of choice and things could be spread out and undensified.
I want to amend a little bit of what you said there because we're very particular about how we talk about this. The automobile has been adopted all over the world, but not everywhere has made all of the same mistakes in terms of their development pattern. So, for example, you can go to a lot of cities in East Asia or in Western Europe, and what you'll find is that people own automobiles. There might even be a very high rate of individual ownership, but you don't use them for absolutely everything day to day, and you don't drive huge distances in the course of your day to day. If you own a car in a European city, you might not be taking it to the grocery store, but you might be taking it out into the country. You might be taking it to drive between cities. So what it is in the US, it's not just that the automobile exists or that it became a vehicle of choice for a lot of people. It's a set of deliberate decisions we made to develop our cities in an automobile-centric way. We talk about auto orientation or autocentricity versus just having cars. Cars are the problem. So I think that's an important distinction. What we've done sort of uniquely in North America, and we've taken this experiment further than the rest of the world has taken it, is mandated a pattern of development that makes it sort of maximally, not even easy, but that is maximally designed to facilitate driving and parking. So we have mandatory off-street parking requirements on the books in almost every city. You have to provide a parking lot or a parking garage for your business, for your apartment building, for your home, whatever. We have very wide roads designed to move high volumes of traffic really quickly. And in a lot of cases, we've sort of demolished the historic fabric of our cities in order to widen roads, in order to put in more parking, in order to facilitate this lifestyle of long-distance automobile commuting. So I think that is really the culprit here, the automobile-oriented development pattern that puts the prerogatives of driving above just about all else.
And I'm wondering if you see a distinction in sort of general terms between rural towns or small rural cities and larger towns or larger cities. I mean, that's an area I find myself thinking about a lot up here in Vermont, where there's a lot of small little towns, and I read a lot of articles about small towns elsewhere across the country that are struggling for one reason or another. They can't retain a younger population. The kids go off to a larger city because the job opportunities are better there, or there's just more going on. It's more exciting, and there's a whole cluster of reasons beyond that. But I guess I just wondered if, in the course of your work and the work of your organization, what have you sort of come to any conclusions or theories about why it is smaller towns, smaller cities, and rural areas and states, are, I hate to use the word struggling, but that seems to be the one that comes to mind. So I'll leave it there.
The Strong Towns message, I mean, one thing that's really fairly unique to us in the space, there are a lot of other people talking about urbanism, talking about the problems with auto orientation, all of that stuff. Strong Towns started with a focus on small towns and rural areas. And our message continues to resonate in those places. And it's because, what we see in those places is that there are a lot of kind of big picture macro reasons why rural areas have struggled in the last half century, but the development pattern and the development choices associated with the suburban experiment have really dealt a crippling blow. we call it the suburban experiment because this mode of development arose with the suburban era, but it's not unique to suburbs. And it's something that actually we've done in thousands of small towns across America. Widened roads, prioritized parking, hollowed out Main Street in favor of, the big box center, the Walmart on the edge of town, the franchise fast food restaurants. You'll see a strip on the edge of a small town with all of that stuff, with gas stations, auto-oriented businesses that's sort of cannibalizing the wealth of the traditional downtown. And if anything, this is more economically and more financially crippling to small towns than it is to big cities, because you're working with a much smaller budget, a much smaller amount of public sector resources to begin with, and less ability to kind of paper over the issue by finding other sources of revenue, by moving money around. Big cities have much more complicated finances. But in small towns, the cost of these choices that we've made, this development pattern that we've adopted, the cost can be really, really stark. And when you kill your downtown, when you kill your Main Street, you're killing your source of resilience. And what we see is that a lot of small towns, but the vast majority of them probably in North America, have become so functionally insolvent that they are basically wards of the state. That they are reliant on transfers from outside, from state government, from federal government, to fund basic operations. And those transfers come with strings attached that often involve priorities that aren't necessarily the priorities of the people who live in that town. And so it's just this really unhealthy set of incentives. You've got places that don't really control their own destiny. You've got places where a lot of the wealth that is created locally is now being siphoned out, because where you used to have a vibrant ecosystem of locally owned businesses, now you have national chains, you have enterprises that are headquartered elsewhere and that are taking the profits elsewhere, and not a whole lot of opportunity. You talk about the young people packing up and leaving these places because there often isn't a whole lot to keep them there. And it's not true across the board. And we love small towns, and there are wonderful things happening in small towns all over the country. But small towns are dealing with a really, really dire set of circumstances. And so what we've said at Strong Towns is that a huge part of the answer needs to be obsessing over the long-term resilience, the financial productivity of your development pattern, which means you focus on downtown, you focus on creating a core that really concentrates wealth and that creates local opportunities to build wealth, local opportunities to be an entrepreneur, be a builder of something, co-create that community and have a stake in it. And ultimately that will look like small towns freeing themselves a little bit from the shackles of being hostage to, the State Department of Transportation or to the federal grant process for, well, what can we do this year in our public works department? Well, we can do whatever we can get a top-down grant for, because we don't have the own source revenue to do it. Well, that's the dynamic that is really toxic, and that small towns have to change, and they have to change it through incremental bottom-up action to really develop in a productive way, really focus on that downtown and on getting that wealth and getting that sense of place back.
What do we mean by resilience? Is it the capacity of a town to kind of, as you say, pay its own way, have enough kind of private sector businesses and other wealth producing entities going on so that the town doesn't have to kind of, look to the state or the federal government for grants and subsidies of one kind or another? Or is there something beyond just sort of a vigorous local economy that comes into play when we talk about resilience?
I'm deliberately using the term in a broad way. Resilience in a place is ultimately the ability of that place to withstand disruption, to withstand shocks. And that requires financial solvency as one key element. You have to be able to pay for the quality of life that everyone there expects. You have to be able to pay to maintain the roads and the sewers and public safety and, all kind of the basics of a functioning local government. I don't think it stops at explicit financial solvency. I think there's also a question of social capital in the community and ecological capital even. There are other elements to resilience that are going to play in. But ultimately, it's the question of if you have a shock, if you have an economic downturn, or if your largest employer leaves or something like that, how hostage are you to these things? How devastating will they be for you? Or do you have a place where there are many hands active in building this community? There are a lot of people who have a stake in it and care about it and are going to stay and are going to perpetuate it year after year, generation after generation. And ultimately, do you have the financial means? Do you have enough private sources of wealth in the community to financially sustain it? You need all of those things. But yeah, ultimately resilience is the ability to withstand disruption.
So are there times when tax credits or other financial incentives like TIF grants, for instance, are there times when, do you think they're generally a good tool to attract or allure businesses or generate investment in a community, or is what you're seeing a situation more like they don't really pay, as a rule, pay for themselves in the long run, or basically cost the community more than whatever that investment brings in?
Tax incentives are a really seductive and kind of dangerous tool. And in general, I think communities, especially smaller ones, need to be really, really wary of how they're using them. And TIF, tax increment financing, is a great example. I'm glad you brought that up. In theory, TIF can be a really powerful tool to jumpstart revitalization or redevelopment in a place. And the way it is supposed to work is that you have to pass what's called the but-for test. And the but-for test is, but for this tax incentive, no development would happen on this site. And so a good example of where that might be valid is something like a Superfund site where there's some cleanup that needs to happen, and no private developer is going to come in and pay for all of that and then build whatever they're going to build on top of it and be able to pencil out. But what you can do is essentially what TIF does is a city will issue a bunch of debt. They'll issue bonds, and they will use that to preemptively fund some aspect of the development of a site. And it's often the public infrastructure that serves the site, or it's something unusual such as environmental cleanup costs that have to happen first. And then that is going to be paid back over time out of the additional property taxes that property generates. So what's called the tax increment. So if I have a site that's right now lying pretty much fallow, maybe there's a couple marginal uses on it, but it's generating very little local revenue. If I put it into a tax increment financing or a TIF district, whatever revenue it's already generating, that's going to keep going to the city. That amount is going to keep going to the city through property taxes, the same as always. So no one's losing anything. And then any additional property taxes above and beyond that are generated from redevelopment are going to go, instead of going into the city's general fund to pay for whatever, they're going to go into the TIF district, and they are going to be used to repay a bunch of costs associated with that development. Could be direct development costs. It could be public infrastructure serving the new development. It could be environmental remediation. It could be any host of things. So you can see that TIF can feel like free money in the sense that, well, nothing was happening here. There was no development here at all. And now we're going to get development. And all the extra revenue coming in just because of that development, that's going to pay off the cost of the development. It's going to be a subsidy to the developer. But if we didn't do this, then we wouldn't have anything there at all. So it's a win-win. The city doesn't lose anything. And eventually the TIF district expires. Typically it's something like 15 or 20 years. And then the city has a nice new development and they have all this revenue. That's in theory how the tool is supposed to work. And the problem is that it's subject to a lot of political interference, and it's subject to short-sighted decision-making. And so in practice, a lot of TIF districts do not pass the but-for test. But for the TIF, nothing would happen here. Typically, a developer will approach a town and say, but for the TIF subsidy, we won't develop this project here. And the question that doesn't get asked is, could a different developer do something? Could we start more incrementally and build up to something? There's a little sleight of hand going on there, where the question, instead of but for the TIF, will anything at all happen on this site? It becomes but for the TIF, will this specific proposal that is being pitched to the local officials, will that happen? And so developers abuse it. They love TIF. They use sometimes heavy-handed tactics to and play cities against each other and try to score that TIF incentive. And a lot of cities are really short-sighted in how they use it, and they end up foregoing opportunities to develop something that might be a little more incremental, might not see the immediate kind of shiny and new payoff, but might ultimately be longer lasting. And instead they go for the shiny project that they can land right away. The classic example of it that we talk about in Strong Towns is in Brainerd, Minnesota, which is where Strong Towns was founded. There, we did a case study of 2 blocks on Brainerd's, the main street that runs through downtown Brainerd. And they're 2 blocks very near each other. They're the same size, so they're served by all the same public infrastructure. And one of them is a really kind of rundown, a little bit blighted row of old small storefronts populated by local businesses. And the other is a block that was very similar, but it was raised and rebuilt as a drive-through fast food restaurant called Taco John's. And the city gave Taco John's a 26-year TIF deal in order to do that. They said, we'll give you tax incentives to put this drive-through franchise restaurant in here because it's going to create jobs. It's going to replace what we see as blight. It's going to bring in customers who are driving through town. And the problem is that Taco John's, occupying a whole city block, is worth like 40% less than the old blighted row of small businesses, like 2 blocks down, the development pattern that it replaced. It's actually worth less, and no one did that math. So TIF feels like free money, and that tends to induce elected officials looking for a quick win or looking for a ribbon cutting to do stupid things with it.
I guess it was on your website. I was looking over a little while ago, and there's one piece there where you talk about incremental builders and developers in the past that put together, housing projects or, small business sites and stuff. And I think the question was, where did all the incremental builders and developers go? And I guess do you have any theories or thoughts on that? I mean, I get this lends itself also to another question I'd love to hear your comments on, which is about housing in general and why it seems to be so hard to build it. But I guess, at this point, it seems like all those incremental developers they're not there anymore, or what happened?
Prior to about the middle of the 20th century, most development in our cities and towns was undertaken by relatively small scale operations, and very often by people who didn't consider real estate developer to be their career or their day job. And you can see that if you look at those pre-World War II neighborhoods in any American city, and you think about who built them. I mean, it was very likely at that time that your house was built by you or your neighbor, or your family, someone you knew, someone who was relatively close to you. You look at something like all through New England, you've got the historic triple-decker houses, at least kind of coastal New England. I don't know, not so much up in Vermont, I think, but Massachusetts is full of triple-deckers, Rhode Island, and a lot of those were built by mill owners as housing for their workforce. They were built by factory owners. They were built by small-time carpenters as a side hustle. And they were bought by people looking for a way into the middle class. They could have a tenant. They could have a little bit of rental income. They were often owned by immigrant families, and it was their stepping stone into building a bit of wealth. So what you did, you had a huge amount of sort of distributed responsibility for creating and owning this development pattern. You had small-scale developers, you had small-scale owners, you had many, many hands working to co-create the city. I cannot overstate how much the post-World War II dominant pattern of development is a radical departure from the historical norm. And what happened is that we came up with a set of systems that make it really, really efficient to produce development at a very large scale to a finished state with large increments of capital. And that was not an accident. This was deliberate policy. For example, the billions and billions of dollars that went into road building post-World War II, most notably the interstate highway system, opened up huge swaths of land for suburban development. And that land was not built by small-time developers. That land was built by big corporations. It was Levittown. It was things like that. And we created, streamlined financing instruments for the kind of developers that do things at a huge scale. In our historic cores, we had urban renewal, same thing. Streamlined sort of public process for establishing and approving kind of huge development sites, and then a whole ecosystem of huge developers operating with Wall Street financing, operating on kind of a strict kind of return on investment framework. And what we have today, what's evolved, and I don't think this was a conspiracy, but what has evolved is a system of planning and development almost everywhere that favors huge scale enterprises and huge increments of capital. If you want to be a small-time developer now, you are at a tremendous disadvantage. And part of the reason is that planning regulations and planning procedures have gotten much, much more complicated and bureaucratic. You can't just kind of buy a plot of land and go out and build something in most cases anymore. You often need exceptions to the zoning code. You need to deal with a whole host of rules around things like parking and setbacks and uses that are allowed and uses that are not allowed and uses that are conditionally allowed. You may have to go through a public hearing in order to get your development approved. You may have to wait months for that public hearing. And when you're waiting months, by the way, you have to control the site that you plan to build on, and you're paying taxes on it, and you're paying insurance, and you have capital tied up in that you can't use somewhere else. So this is a system that is efficient for big, deep-pocketed corporate developers, and it's ruinous for small-time developers. It's just really, really hard to do this. You can't bear the delay, the uncertainty, the costs, as well as what the incremental developers I know today call the return on brain damage. You have return on investment, but you also have return on brain damage, which is how much am I going to suffer just going through the process of trying to convince the city to let me build, a fourplex, and my neighbors are yelling at me and everybody's worried about parking. And big developers can overcome these obstacles. There's kind of a rule of thumb about bureaucracy that I think the more complicated a system is, the more hurdles involved, the more that system is going to favor well-connected insiders who know how to game it, who know the rules, who are expert at the game, who can hire the lawyer who is expert at the game. And so that's a big part of the story. And again, it wasn't a single conspiracy. It was a lot of factors, but we have radically changed the way we build our cities and who is involved, who gets to be a developer in the suburban era under what we call the suburban experiment at Strong Towns. It was a radical experiment in law, in finance, in land use regulation, in all of these things. And what it adds up to is that we are very, very good at financing and building, new development at very large scales by corporate entities that are generally not very responsive to bottom-up feedback from the community. And we've made it really, really hard to do anything small.
We'll be featuring other town leaders soon on some of their thoughts on how to build strong towns, ones that are resilient and forward-looking. For now, for the GNAT-TV News Project, I'm Andrew McKeever.